Martin Scorsese, the man who made cinema cool, then made it hilariously uncool. Martin Scorsese. The name alone is enough to make any cinephile say, wow, this guy gets it. He's the director who gave us The Godfather's sibling, the king of gritty New York, and the man who made you feel like you were living in the underbelly of society, even if you've never been within 5 miles of a mobster. But here's the thing about Martin. He didn't just make films. He redefined films as a medium, and then, for some reason, spent the next 30 years making it harder for normal people to sit through his movies. Martin Scorsese, the man who made cinema feel like a 5-hour lecture on Italian cinema. In the early 70s, Martin Scorsese was the angry kid from New York with a camera and a chip on his shoulder about everything that wasn't real cinema. He wasn't interested in making Hollywood fluff. He wanted to make films that took you to the darkest corners of society. And how did he start? With a film called Mean Streets, a gritty little movie that launched his career and gave the world the dynamic duo of De Niro and Keitel, both of whom looked like they just walked out of a mobster's wet dream. It wasn't so much a film as it was a comedic, tragic exploration of how you can't trust anyone who's Italian and wearing a leather jacket. And this annoys me because I'm Italian descent and I was never very proud of Scorsese. The 70s were his wild, rebellious decade. Scorsese was all about pushing boundaries and making us uncomfortable, with Taxi Driver in 1976, for example. So then in the 80s, he made Raging Bull, which I watched once and I don't remember anything about it. It's about a boxer who becomes a loser. The Last Temptation of Christ, which I tried to watch. Martin went and made a film that got him excommunicated from Catholicism. I guess he got in trouble for that. Scorsese wasn't just making films at this point. He was making statements. His movies weren't just stories, which is what they were supposed to be. They were about what it feels like to be a man on the edge of sanity. His approach? Take a bunch of chaotic characters, throw them into situations that could only end in violence, betrayal, or both, and let the camera linger on the misery until you, the viewer, wanted to crawl into a hole and hide. Because, hey, that's what life's really like, right? But Scorsese didn't just stop at making gritty dramas about mobsters and troubled souls. He decided that every single person in a movie should suffer like they'd been hit with a frying pan of existential dread. You wanted more realism? Well, here you go. Half-baked psychology, long monologues about finding meaning in the meaningless, and camera angles that made you feel like you were trapped in a nightmare that had a runtime of 2 hours and 45 minutes. God, this guy bores me so much. Just making a video about him bores me to death. By now, Scorsese had cemented his place as the heavyweight champion of films about psychotic, self-destructive men. He had an Oscar, a godlike status in the world of cinema, and naturally, he wanted more. So what did Martin do? He went full throttle into historical epics and serious dramas and 3-hour films. If Scorsese made a movie, it was going to feel like you'd sat in a chair for 3 days straight with no bathroom breaks. Goodfellas, I don't really understand why everybody says the greatest movie ever made. I don't, whatever, it's a movie. Like, I remember when I was a kid, right? I'm Italian descent. I watched this movie and I'm like, this is just showing a bunch of guys being bullies, right? That's all this, it's just like machismo. Like, it's embarrassing. I mean, if you want to glorify Italians, there's better ways to do it. Mobsters aren't the best thing Italy's ever came up with. I mean, Italians created law, the law system, the legal system. It's almost unaltered since it was created, since they created it. They perfected it. Paintings, music, everything. Italians invented everything. America was named after an Italian, Amerigono. I forget what his name was. My favorite movie by Scorsese is called Kundun, because it's about Buddhism, and I think Buddhism is really cool, and it's historically accurate, and it's just, the thing about Scorsese is he's similar to Spielberg, where he's very, very good director, but he's no writer whatsoever. I don't think he's even tried to write anything. I've only seen Taxi Driver once. I can see why that could be considered good, because it's got a point to it. Like, there's a meaning, that like a former guy that was in the army, how he's got PTSD, and how he's lost, and how the system treats him like crap. Okay, so there's a point. There's like a moral to the story. Cape Fear was a pretty good horror movie, sort of like thriller. But again, there's no real meaning behind it. There's no moral to the story. It's just a good movie. That's it. It's just good popcorn. Then he enters his Leonardo DiCaprio phase, where he does Shutter Island, which I watched it. I thought nothing of it. Piece of crap. The Departed, okay, it's a switcheroo movie. Okay, great. And then Wolf of Wall Street. These movies are so forgettable, I struggled to even remember them. Okay, so Gangs of New York, 2002, the film that tried to make the 19th century 5 Points area seem interesting. And it was, but it's also like watching a long, depressing episode of Survivor New York edition. Everybody's gonna die, you just don't know when. And who can forget the so-called masterpiece that is The Wolf of Wall Street? God, that movie sucked. Martin took everything we know about greed, excess, and the absolute worst people you could ever meet, and turned it into a 3-hour orgy of cocaine, sleaze, and embarrassing dancing. No meaning whatsoever. That should be his, that's his monocle. It amounted to a movie about nothing, which could be said for all his movies. Moniker? And then he brought Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci back for The Irishman in 2019, which is essentially a movie about... I never watched it, I never will. Which is essentially a movie about old guys staring at each other for 3 hours. Wow. Never seen it. Never will. While the camera slowly pans around their faces like it's the last minutes of an art installation. That movie was 2.5 hours of men... I thought it was 3. Explaining how they felt in the 50s while everyone lost the ability to look remotely human. At this point, Scorsese was making movies not only pushing boundaries, but actively pushing the audience away. Because who doesn't want to sit through a film that feels like an elegy for the past, followed by 30 minutes of watching Robert De Niro's digital face trying to pretend he's 30? Martin Scorsese in the 2020s is like that old guy yelling at kids to get off his lawn while simultaneously streaming on Netflix. In a world dominated by superhero films and constant reboots, Martin has turned into the grumpy uncle who tells everyone that movies aren't movies anymore. The man who just a few years ago got into an all-out Twitter feud with Marvel fans, calling the films theme park rides. He's right about that, but what he's wrong about is that his movies are better than theme park rides, and claiming they had no artistic merit, as if he does have artistic merit. He doesn't have artistic merit. In a world where everything is a franchise and reboots are faster than Netflix can churn out content, Scorsese is the only one still shouting about the sanctity of the true film experience. Isn't that an oxymoron, a true film experience? Sure, we get it, Martin. Movies suck today. But do you have to remind us while you're in the middle of making the longest Netflix movie ever? The irony is not lost on anyone. Well, I think it's lost on many, in fact. So what do we make of Martin Scorsese's career? Well, he's undeniably a master of his craft, but his craft happens to suck. And he is also a man who spent decades making cinema so art house and bleak that half of the audience wasn't sure if they needed to book a therapy session after watching. His legacy is complex. He's the godfather of American cinema and the king of cinematic misery, whose work was so annoying that it inspired a generation of filmmakers who now only make movies about superheroes with no soul. But hey, at least Martin is still around yelling at kids to stop playing with their phones while they watch movies about CGI robots hitting each other. God, making this video was a miserable experience. If I can get 1 subscriber from this video, then at least it wasn't entirely a waste of time.